Thanks for showing up for cozy Christmas Eve Dharma night. Nice to be able to do this together. Let's wait another minute or so, see if anybody else is going to join us. And we'll begin to take our time, compose ourselves, making a temple out of our body. And no matter how our body is, there's a way for our body to express this intention in our heart, to be right in the middle, to be relaxed, to be awake, alert. And also to express this deep valuing of simplicity, nothing extra. And this is true for the heart and for the body. No unnecessary affect, like some subtle attempt to look like a Buddhist. No leaning forward, no holding back. So even the simple activity of composing the body for a sitting meditation time, it has real integrity. Nothing forced or contrived. Hard to put in language. We might say this interest in being real, unaffected, open, sensitive, unafraid to be feeling what's here to be felt, which means this willingness to be vulnerable, naturally vulnerable to what's moving in our heart and mind, what's moving around us and in us. And feeling the activity of the body, and in particular, the simple activity of breathing in and breathing out. And let's explore the simple pleasure of leaving behind all of what our mind is in the habit of doing. And instead, simply track the sensations of breathing in and breathing out. Allow the breath to continue naturally, even if it feels controlled, just let the breath happen. And simply practice keeping in mind the sensations as you breathe in, keeping in mind the sensations of breathing out. So we're learning how to be interested in this, we could call it an exclusive meditation object. Everything else falls into the background. And we're intentionally having the sensations of breathing in and out in the foreground of one's attention. And we'll, with practice, discover the pleasure of being truly intimate with a natural process of breathing without imposing some idea, without needing to control the breath. This is a very important skill, to be clearly aware, but not expressing any control, any fixed view. Simply keeping the breath in mind as it actually is, this natural physical process of breathing in and breathing out as felt in the body. In Buddhist practice, we talk about the pleasure of seclusion, or perhaps described as the pleasure of simplicity, the pleasure of the mind secluded from its normal habits of mental proliferation. Learning how to be interested in something simple, ordinary, like the sensations of breathing in, and learning how to sustain it, to sustain this interest without getting tight. And you might notice how the breath becomes more refined as things settle down. So actually checking out in our own experience, is there a simple but still beautiful pleasure that arises as the mind becomes more simple and more secluded from its ordinary activity of mental proliferation, simply by using this training of tracking the physicality of breathing in and breathing out to the exclusion of whatever else the mind might be interested in. And if there is some pleasure, just follow the thread of that pleasure. If a little bit of continuity, wholehearted, relaxed continuity brings some pleasure, then maybe an even more unwavering, relaxed attention will bring even more pleasure of seclusion. And be willing to begin again and again, gentle and forgiving. And we appreciate the conditioning of our mind to want to think about this and that. So we take up this training in order to explore what the Buddha describes as a wholesome, trustworthy pleasure, this pleasure of seclusion. And whenever you feel like there's some continuity, some settledness that has come from the continuity, then the Buddha instructs us while breathing in, experiencing the whole body, and while feeling the breath going out, practice experiencing the whole body. So no longer this exclusive attention to the breath, although still tracking the simple physicality of breathing in and out. But using that rhythm of breathing in and breathing out to be aware, to receive, and to allow the bodily sensations to be the way they are, the whole body. So we're practicing not being confused by whatever bodily sensations are felt as we breathe in, and whatever bodily sensations are being felt as we breathe out. Not in conflict, not feeling obliged to fix or control the bodily sensations that are being felt. Both the subtle and the gross, this all-inclusive awareness of body as we breathe in and breathe out. And remember to allow the breath to be as subtle or as gross as it wants to be. We're making the effort to be interested in the whole body as we breathe in, and this willingness to be interested in the whole body as we breathe out. And the beautiful healing pleasure of seclusion is in part due to the willingness to let the world, all of our other worldly concerns, fall far into the background, even disappear for a while. The Buddha is asking us with the fourth instruction to train ourselves while breathing in, calming the bodily formation, and training oneself while breathing out, calming the bodily formation. So we're choosing to be interested, sensitive to any embodied sense of well-being as we're breathing in, as we're breathing out, however faint that beautiful quality of well-being, embodied calm, embodied well-being might be. We just choose to keep it in mind. And just naturally inviting it to spread. So over time, with practice, breathing in, experiencing that well-being throughout the body, that bodily calm everywhere, as we breathe in, as we breathe out. But be patient. Don't look at what's in the way of bodily calm. See if you can sense where there is bodily calm, and keep that in mind as you're breathing in and out. And it will naturally spread. It's really the calm, the sense of bodily well-being, because the mind isn't in conflict with the body. The mind that knows, the mind that feels, doesn't have a problem with the body as it's being experienced. Learn how to trust and appreciate this wholesome quality of embodied well-being, embodied calm, however you're experiencing it, whether it's clear and strong or faint. Just practice being interested and keeping it in mind, encouraging it, allowing it to spread and widen and deepen, allowing it to have its healing effect. And as we finish up our sitting time, take some time and just sensing the pleasure, the wholesome pleasure that you're sensing. Feel the positive effects from the sitting practice, whatever they might be like. kind of calm or integration or settledness, sense of wholeness. It's really important at the end of sitting time that we do take that time. Basically observing cause and effect. And whenever you feel ready, just begin to gently stretch and move the body, open the eyes, but take your time. It's really nice to see people showing up tonight. I didn't, I was wondering how many people would come, given that so many folks have family gatherings on Christmas Eve. So I thought it would be nice to talk about the path, the Buddhist teachings, and the path that he teaches as a pleasurable path, because often, in moments at least, if not most of the time, it can feel a little bit overwhelming. There's an interesting article you can download if you want. It's available online, written by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Most of you know, I'm guessing, Bhikkhu Bodhi, a Western Buddhist monk who practiced in Sri Lanka for many decades, but is now back in the States. He's quite old, and just a very important translator of the early teachings into English. But he has an article you can download online called The Taste of Freedom. It's just like 6 or 7 pages. And it's really based on that quote from the Buddha that I think I might have mentioned in a previous talk not that long ago. Just as in the great ocean, there is but one taste, the taste of salt, so in this doctrine and discipline, there is but one taste, the taste of freedom. And then in that article, Bhikkhu Bodhi writes, at every level, the flavor of the teaching is of a single nature, the flavor of freedom. It is only the degree to which this flavor is enjoyed that differs. And the difference in degree is precisely proportional to the extent of one's practice. Practice a little Dhamma, and one reaps a little freedom. Practice an abundant Dhamma, and one reaps abundant freedom. The Dhamma brings its own reward of freedom, always with the exactness of scientific law. He's basically saying, the practice has, in just the most simple terms, is about letting go. And we're letting go of, the afflictions, those forces, those conditioned habits that torment the heart, the mind. And then when the mind and heart is tormented, agitated, well, the body and the mind, of course, are tethered, tied together, and they reflect each other. And so the body then also has its own version of contraction or tension related to the mind's tension. And in that article, Bhikkhu Bodhi talks about this paradox, that where the Buddhist teachings talk a lot about freedom from suffering and release, the unshakable release of the heart. I mean, these are extraordinary promises, this unshakable, unconditioned, meaning not dependent on conditions being any particular way. And yet, the practice, if you really give yourself to the practice, it's really hard to be present in with any kind of continuity. The force of habit, it will express its momentum to worry, to plan, to judge ourselves, to judge others. to fantasize about what's scary, to fantasize about what's exciting and seductive. So it's a bit of a setup because, and he talks about this in the article, we imagine, when we think about freedom, we generally think about it in terms of me being free to do whatever I want, free of constraints. I can eat as much as I want. I can watch as many episodes of the programs I like as I want. I can do whatever I want, that sort of uninhibited pursuit of pleasure and that uninhibited pursuit of getting rid of the irritations in my life. And boy, would I be free. But is that, to whatever degree we've given ourselves permission, does it lead to freedom, or do we become imprisoned by our likes and dislikes? That's the question. And so Bhikkhu Bodhi, in the article, he contrasts the kind of more typical freedom as a normal, ordinary person will imagine freedom. Freedom, he calls it the license, to do whatever we want, with the freedom of spiritual autonomy. I probably would describe this saying something like the freedom that comes from not being dependent on our likes and dislikes, not pushed around by liking and disliking. We still, the heart, because of the way we've been conditioned, there will be the likes and the dislikes. It's too cold, or it's too hot, or whatever. But the heart doesn't have to be dependent or confused by liking and disliking. And that is a different kind of freedom, like to have a conditioned mind, to have preferences, but not to be burdened by them. I'm in Massachusetts right now, and it's been cold lately and snowy, I need to get my exercise, but I don't really want to go outside. And because I'm out of town, I couldn't bring all my winter gear. If I were home in Minnesota, I'd really, I could handle it because I've got all kinds of stuff to keep me warm. But when you've got just your carry-on bag and you're away for a month, well, you don't bring your winter boots and you don't bring, your big coat and you don't bring a lot of things. And there is the, pleasure of when it's warm enough and I can walk comfortably. But there's a more subtle, but more profound pleasure of not turning the uncertainty of weather into a personal problem. We generally don't highlight that pleasure. It's a little bit like we did in the guided meditation, like to really get to know, because it's really a pleasure about what's not there. Like, so if we really did a good job just tracking the breath coming in and going out to such a degree that our mind had to let go of its normal activities of mental proliferation, worrying about this, planning, comparing, wondering, doubting. If that really, those typical activities of our mind were really abandoned for a period of time, and because of the prompt, we noticed the absence of that, let's call it neurotic activity, and really got to know the pleasure. It's the pleasure of the absence of the typical mental activity. The mind is secluded from what it would normally be doing. And we can experience that. Just like toward the end of the guided meditation tonight, and you probably, some of you recognize that these were the Buddha's instructions, the first part of the Anapanasati Sutta, the discourse on mindfulness of breathing, where the Buddha, there's different parts of that discourse, but the main part is the Buddha's giving 16 instructions that really encompasses the whole path. It's probably his most sophisticated meditation instructions that has been, was collected and maintained over the many centuries. And the first four instructions we kind of covered during the guided meditation. And near the end, the instructions number 3 and 4, it's really being aware of the whole body. And, we might have an old body, we may have a painful body, we might have a body with a lot of disease or a lot of injuries, or we might have a very youthful, healthy body. But regardless of the kind of body that's here now for us, there is a way to realize an embodied calm, an embodied well-being that's independent of the particular body we have, because that well-being is really about the way the mind is relating to the body, like relating with kindness and relating with acceptance and not being in conflict with the bodily sensations as we breathe in and as we breathe out. So that pervading of embodied well-being is really just the natural effect of what's not there. The mind is practicing not being irritated by the body, not confused by bodily sensations, not amplifying its preferences. Some part of the body might be cool, but instead of attending to that experience of not liking the part of my body, my toes are cold or something like that, the mind is attending. It's like the realization that contentment isn't actually dependent on the particular conditions. Contentment is a way of relating to conditions. And we can be content, like we may not see it as a possibility, but if we're prompted, we could all probably be content with the conditions in our life right now. It just so happens, unfortunately, that the default habit is to be discontent with the conditions of our lives. The Dalai Lama has a pithy little quote. Some of you maybe have heard me say it or read it on your own, but he said, instead of being content with our spiritual practice and discontent with what we have, we should flip that. We should be discontent with our spiritual practice, wanting to put in more time and more sincerity, and content with what we have, the possessions or circumstances that we have in life. And it's not like I'm trying to be a goody-goody or someone's trying to be a goody-goody. It's just a very simple, direct, and effective way to be happy, to feel good. Right? The same thing with metta practice, loving kindness practice. It feels so good to be loving. It feels so good to be generous. There are very direct, effective ways to be happy, but we don't kind of pursue that. And that's kind of interesting. And so I thought it might be good just to reflect on that tonight and save some time, of course, for people to share their own experiences too. I'll read a section from the Dhammapada. This is a collection of Buddhist verses from the early discourses. Those attached to passion are caught in a river of their own making, like a spider caught in its own web. But having cut even this, the wise set forth, free from longing, abandoning all suffering. Let go of the past, let go of the future, let go of the present, gone beyond becoming. With the mind released in every way, you do not again undergo birth and old age. For people who have agitated thoughts and intense passion, and who are focused on what's pleasant, craving grows more and more. Indeed, they strengthen their bonds. But those who delight in calming their thoughts are always mindful and cultivate a focus on what's unpleasant, will bring an end to craving. They will cut Mara's bonds. Fearless, free of craving, and without blemish, having reached the goal and destroyed the arrows of becoming, one is in one's final body. And then at the end of this chapter, the gift of the Dharma surpasses all gifts. The taste of the Dharma surpasses all tastes. The delight in Dharma surpasses all delights. The destruction of craving conquers all suffering. So it is a bit of a catch-22, the abandoning of all craving. And that's this, freedom of non-dependence, freedom of spiritual autonomy, as Bhikkhu Bodhi describes it. And it really, like in a lot of the Buddhist teachings, it really centers around our experience of feeling tone. And that's why in the Dhammapada section I just read, the Buddha says there that we keep not focused on pleasure, but we keep focused on suffering. And you might remember, if you've one of the interesting maps, the Buddha, one of the obligations the Buddha had, given how he was teaching, is he had to describe the experience of suffering as a natural process, right? Because he's basically making the point that all of what we experience as a human being is nature. And the things that appear to us to be very personal, that's also nature. So internal experience, external experience, it's all the movement of a natural processes. And so the Buddha mapped out like how it is that this experience you and I have of very personally suffering, right? It really seems like I'm suffering when I'm suffering. Like, how is that a natural process? And that teaching is called dependent co-arising or dependent origination. And he also had to map out the awakening process, the heart releasing the habit of clinging, the burning of desire, the grip of hate, the net of delusion, the way that clinging begets dukkha, suffering, and suffering causes clinging. Like when we're suffering, we're really attached to getting rid of the suffering. We cling to different ways to be free. We approach the suffering from this personal point of view, and that's what perpetuates dukkha, suffering. It's the not understanding, the misunderstanding of suffering that is, in a sense, the proximate or the deep cause for suffering. Because when the Buddha maps out the awakening process as a natural process, it starts with a human being suffering. But interestingly, suffering begets faith, right? So that's sort of, instead of suffering and hating it and thrashing around trying to be someone who's not suffering, right? So we, like in the second dart discourse on the second dart, the second arrow, the Buddha says, when we're really hurting, we become really attached to sensual pleasures because we don't know any way to modify the pain in life except to have something pleasant. I noticed it, like even tonight, preparing for the talk before we began, it was like that habit of the mind to dangle pleasant things, like you just do this, Mark, you get this done. And then when it's all done, you get to do this, you know? And fortunately, I saw it, so I didn't get, it didn't become a trap for, and a cause for stress. But it's endemic in our mind. So there's another way that suffering, when we're suffering, when there's some interest in the suffering, or when we hear some teachings like from the Buddha, then there can be, even if initially it's borrowed faith, there's some faith that it doesn't have to be this way. And I'm sure this is true for some of you. It's definitely true for me. I think it's the real fruit of having been practicing now for many decades, is that when I'm suffering, very quickly the mind gets curious. It's almost like, this is interesting, because I'm pretty sure that suffering is optional. So what's going on? What's the mind not seeing clearly? And it's not to say that pain is optional. Pain, being too cold or being too hot or being too full, or, you know, feeling the loss of a friend, loss of a loved one. There is real pain in life. But suffering is when the mind feels that the pain makes a personal problem out of the inevitable pain that comes with life. So it's called transcendent origination instead of dependent origination. So this mapping, the Buddha's map of the awakening process. So it goes suffering to faith, like, oh, there's another way. There's another possibility here. And joy arises next, right? It's sort of like brightness, this joyful interest. Okay, let's do this. And rapture and tranquility and happiness and concentration and the deepening of insight, which leads to disenchantment and dispassion and letting go. And then the knowledge, the sort of understanding of that letting go, or the integration. That's that map, transcendent origination. You can just Google, the Buddha's transcendent origination, and you'll get the sutta where he talks about this. So this is, I think, for me, was in my early years of practice, it was really helpful to understand this about the Buddhist teachings, because just intuitively, it just made sense that sort of whatever wisdom I had would be used to sort of follow some trustworthy thread of pleasure. And there's a turning point, where we start to see the limitations of pursuing sense pleasures, because one, it's stressful to have to get them, and we can't hold on to them. They don't last. So we look for other things. Naturally human beings gravitate like to wholesome relationships. And then even those are fragile, and then sort of a more universal love and generosity, instead of this like taking care of my own and loving my own friends or my own circle, but just a more universal expression of those wholesome qualities, right? But we generally, if we keep just paying attention to what actually delivers real happiness, we'll stumble upon the happiness of renunciation or letting go. So the happiness more about what's not there than the happiness of acquisition, getting something. Because whatever we get is going to, then we're afraid of it going away or have to protect it from going away, which we can't. But just in simple terms, the happiness of non-clinging, or there's what moment, what condition might arise for me where I couldn't practice non-clinging, non-attachment, right? We can express that happiness, we can realize that happiness of non-attachment in any experience. It's unconditioned. That experience of happiness isn't dependent on any condition. I really appreciated this simile that I heard probably more than 30 years ago from Joseph Goldstein. I don't know if he says it or uses it much anymore. But I don't remember exactly how he said it, but basically, somebody jumps out of an airplane and eventually they're doing fine. And then they realize they forgot to put the parachute on. And so they're totally freaking out as they're falling, freaking out, because they think they're going to hit the ground. And then after a long time, they realize, there's no ground to hit, right? And this is sort of this, it's an attempt, Joseph's attempt, to talk about the experience of non-clinging. It's like free fall. Because so much of our experience of sense experience, sensuality, this existence, body-mind existence that we're having now, what makes it come to life is the clinging. It's actually, the way the Buddha describes it, I think I mentioned already earlier in the talk, the burning of desire, the grip of hate, the net of delusion. These are what animate this existence of ours. It gives shape, it gives substance. Suffering in the different ways, greed and hate especially animate our existence, makes it substantial for us. So we have to really appreciate how radical, because clinging, attachment, it goes very deep. It's very subtle. It's not just the obvious things that we're attached to. And that's why, I've been reading this quote a lot lately from Ajahn Chah, that where you experience suffering, you also find freedom from suffering. Trying to run away from suffering is actually to run toward it. Right? So this point that peace is found in the same place where agitation is and suffering is. And it's the difference between our normal way of relating, which is greed, hatred, and delusion, which creates the stickiness in life, the burning, the grip, the confusing net, and the letting go of that. In a way, you can think of the whole scope of the path as realizing it matters what we pay attention to, and just paying attention to what needs to be seen, what isn't being seen clearly, until we can finally, awareness, in a sense, takes up nibbana as the meditation object, or free fall, the free fall of non-clinging. Not what I'm not clinging to, but the not clinging itself. The not being established anywhere, not located anywhere. Like who I am is really about like what the mind is clinging to. So just some more concrete examples. Um, and again, this path of renunciation, it's really the deeper part of the Buddhist teachings. It's really about letting go, about the pleasure that arises because of what's not there, what's been abandoned, what's ceased. So even something relatively straightforward like sila, ethical conduct, is the the freedom of not having to follow our impulses, to take what's not ours, to say something that's hurtful. And we might think of restraint as something that's heavy, but it's so liberating, given that we have impulses because of our conditioning. It's so liberating to have impulses, but not have to act on them, not have to repress them even. Like I can now, I think of it as, yeah, it's just like a spiritual superpower. I can have lust, but not be confused or pushed around by lust. Like just that attraction or wanting something. And because of the way I'm conditioned by culture like everybody else. And so sometimes the mind that gets triggered, like to want something. But wisdom is also there knowing that, yeah, that's just wanting. And it feels like this, that burning of wanting. Oh, yeah, that's just that burning of wanting. It's so interesting to to really get interested in that burning of wanting and to feel the liberation of not having to be confused by it, not having to take it to personalize it. And the same thing, it's like whether I'm reading the news or something happens that just brings up disgust or anger or like it shouldn't be this way, self-righteous condemnation, and just not to be confused by that very clear and strong emotional response. It blooms, but there's no stickiness to it. It doesn't have to be. I'm not saying it's always that way. I'm not obviously fully awakened, but um, just to sense that liberation, that freedom. Donna, I'm still working on, but it's another place where we can get a very concrete experience of the absence of stinginess. Like we'll feel like, I definitely, this is a really interesting place of practice for me because I have a lot of stinginess just been conditioned in just through my family history and, the, my parents grew up on, relatively poor farms in the Dust Bowl time in North Dakota and Eastern Montana, in the 20s and 30s, Depression, and it was kind of drought conditions during those years when they were young. And so, and we had a big family. I was the middle of 7 kids. And so there's just kind of a stingy vibe around food and just growing up kind of middle class, mostly middle class. And so I have it, and I see it a lot. And and it can get triggered all the time. I just notice like being a little bit protective of my stuff and my routines and I really have an attachment to looking like I'm generous, but I have a lot of conditioning around stinginess. And I've really had to be thoughtful and courageous about uh, pushing beyond that strong and well defended, well articulated within my own mind, like defense of what I need, or you're giving too much, or you deserve, you need this, so you can do good work in the world, or something like that. It's just, and I'm not saying that, like I said, it's well, it's like a good lawyer has sort of created a nice brief that's explaining like why you have a right to, but what's not okay, it's not wrong for me to have stuff. I don't think that. But what I know is wrong is the fear and the greed and the tightness, because I feel that directly as suffering, right? It's and in those places where I've been more courageous and just say, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to give this, you know, it's like liberation from being a stingy person. It feels so good. It doesn't feel good to be a stingy person. And it feels good in all those little places, and then generally over time, just the more and more the nature to be giving, to be wanting to share, wanting to give, wanting to support, because it feels good. And even, the like you could take something like the 16 steps and see each step as a letting go of something in a way that leads to pleasure, spiritual pleasure, onward leading. Like even the first step that we spent a lot of time tonight, where we were using the physicality of the breath in a more exclusive way and using it to let go of whatever else the mind would be doing. Like just to really get to know that as a pleasure. Be grateful for that pleasure of seclusion. Like as hard as that can be when our mind is busy or worried about things and keeps going back to some content, spinning this way, spinning that way, as tough as it can be, we can be motivated to stick with it because we have this deepening sense of how trustworthy that pleasure is when the mind really does put it down and yields or submits to the training of just being with the breath, the in-breath from the beginning all the way to the end of the in-breath, and being with the out-breath from the beginning to the end. And just to sense what that does to the body and the mind, that simplicity is so soothing on a deeper level to the body and the mind. The absence of the diversity of our experience, right? Because it's, in a sense, being suppressed because we're training just to be with the physicality of breathing in and out. And so the mind experiences a relative simplicity. And it feels good not to be tormented by the diversity of experience, and especially the diversity of what we might be thinking about and imagining and wondering. And everything we think, then we have to have an opinion about what we just thought or imagined. And it's just one thought begets the next. And it's oppressive. And to leave that all behind and to only know something simple. This is why jhana, in a worldly sense, when the mind is completely absorbed in its own pleasure of seclusion, is considered the most profound worldly pleasure. So, as a human being, there is no pleasure more satisfying than the mind letting go of the world and worldliness. But the deepest release is the mind realizing the reality of non-attachment, the reality of non-grasping. Because then we don't even need to be in a deep state of samadhi, a deep state of concentration, right? That in the world of conversation, in the world of experience, but not attached, not clinging. This is from Sayadaw Tejaniya. Your experience is only the knowing and the known, whether with reference to the object or awareness. What is it like when it's personalized? And how is that experience different when it's not personalized? Find out. I thought I'd just read the last couple paragraphs from Gil Fronsdal has a short reflection on Nibbana that was in Tricycle back in 2006. And the last section he writes, experiencing Nibbana is like taking a dip in a refreshing pond. A quick dip and we're slightly refreshed. With a long soak, we're thoroughly refreshed. Even the first brief dip into Nibbana is a powerful lesson in the possibility of great happiness, freedom, and peace, not dependent on the conditions of the world. As long as someone believes happiness can only be found through the right conditions, it makes sense to cling to those conditions, even when knowing full well that all conditioned phenomena are subject to change. But when there is a direct, visceral experience of an alternative, the enchantment that fuels this clinging lessens dramatically. So let's leave it here so we have some time. Yeah, it's so good to hear from each other and your own experience of pleasure on the path. It'd be nice if some people are willing, just little testimonials about the very real pleasure you've experienced, the healing pleasures, the pleasure of peace, the arising of joy, the pleasure of a heart expressing metta, loving kindness. Yeah. And then, of course, any questions that come to mind or other reflections you'd like to share with the group that seem related. People can just go ahead and unmute yourself. It's always nice to share your first name if you don't mind, and maybe where you're calling from. Also, feel free to share your pronouns if you'd like. Anybody want to get us started? What comes to mind?
This is more the latter than the former about the other questions. Is that okay?
Oh, sure. Yeah, anything you want, Freda.
So, I've got my toes in the world pretty far into the waters. And actually I follow Bhikkhu Bodhi and I hear his talks sometimes. And he is not removed from the world at all.
No. And he's old too, and he's still quite involved.
Not old. He's a year younger than my oldest sister. He's 80 years old.
Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't help that. I feel like my sister might have known him at Brooklyn College, though she probably didn't. Anyway, so and he has very strong positions on the war in Gaza, which I agree with. And I sitting here thinking about that, and I think about what can I actually do? What can I actually do? And I have a couple friends here in Erie who are Muslims and maybe even know people over there, but it's like not knowing what I other than giving money. What can I actually do that would make a difference other than giving money? There's some suffering in that, I suppose, in a way. Yeah, I can. It sounds like you've got enough to respond on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that because there's so many examples, it's not just what's going on in the Middle East, right? There's just within our own families. There's so many of these conundrums that are asking and begging for engagement and response. And so our job is to be fearless about action and fearless about non-action, not to have a preference, not to presume we know, to have humility. So, and humility doesn't liberate us from acting. Like we want to be like our life. We don't want to have a plan about like, oh, I'm going to do something about the Middle East, or I'm not going to do something. Oh, I don't have to do something about the Middle East. That's other people's problem. Like we don't want to have a plan. We want to be open and responsive. We want our life to be that kind of natural process. So your engagement, your activism, let's say, Freda, it doesn't have to follow some preordained map that you've fixed for yourself. This is what I'm going to do. You can just be wide open and sensitive, and something might move your heart, but it might be just an earthworm on the highway that you pick up and move to the side of the road where there's some earth for it to crawl into, right? Or another thing might move you and you write a check to some NGO that's, taking care of injured people in Gaza, or, whatever you might do, or you might just make a nice bath for yourself and take care of your body. What's, because often what we do about these conundrums, these places of suffering, is we sympathetically start to suffer. But that doesn't help anybody. That just adds to the suffering in the world. So to practice being free in our responsivity, natural responsivity to what we're sensitive to live as a natural process. Because all of the real suffering and oppression in life, in our world, is coming not because people are living in this natural way, right? They're living animated by greed, hatred, and delusion, by clinging. You know, the clinging is the greed, hatred, and delusion is the sort of expression of that clinging. Like the Buddha used the image of fire burning on fuel. Upadana is the Pali for the flame burning. And the first and foremost task for us human beings is to stop adding fuel, stop reinforcing that tendency, right, to cling to the aggregates, to take our activity personally. So then it's really like, well, it will be interesting to see what you do if you do something or if you don't do something. But your real intention is not to suffer, to express the release of love, the release of engagement, right? There's really no way to have a life without engagement. Sitting on a couch and avoiding things is just one way of engagement, right? So we're all engaged. It's just about whether the engagement is an expression of freedom or not. I hope that's helpful.
Have done things. It's just, there's no end to it. Yeah. But no, it's very helpful. It is.
Yeah. Thanks for getting us started, Freda. Still time for a couple more folks to speak. Pleasure on the path, anyone?
I'll say something about that. Yeah, I mean, I think that as when I started practicing, I was coming from a place where like I just had very little ability to take care of myself in any kind of productive way, and and it took, some time to just sort of struggling to like sit on a cushion for 5 minutes, or like, that kind of, was the time yet, and that kind of thing. But I think finding common ground was instrumental in like the whole thing about dana, and like being able to receive a gift of the energy, the time, the teachings, was like really amazing to me, because I was not in any position to have a transactional relationship in that kind of way. I couldn't have like shown up and paid you any kind of money for that, even if you were asking for it. And so there's been this really great pleasure in like receiving that, watching the practice really sort of take effect in my life, and like how there's lots of, there's even compulsions that I've watched sort of just kind of lift off, things that had tried to get rid of for years, that like, as soon as I sort of kind of was able to be mindful and have this cause and effect sort of closeness, the compulsion just sort of lifted, because I could see, and I could feel. I think the heart was like, oh, that's what's happening. And it just sort of let it go. And so I think that's really a lovely thing. And another thing is, I think that volunteering, like I do some stuff at Common Ground right now. I'm in Barre, Massachusetts, at Barre Center for Buddhist Studies, doing a working guest retreat. And there's something about finding out that how much not doing something for others, but like being helpful for the sake of my own joy, has really been amazing. And again, these are kind of the organizations that allow that kind of freedom to find those things out. So,
Yeah, beautiful testimonial, Jessica. I appreciate that. How about other folks? Pleasure on the path?
I can share a little. Um, I'm Steve. I'm in Minneapolis, he, him pronouns. Um, your reference to metta, of course, reminded me of this and how important it's been. And I guess I don't imagine it's too different for anybody else, but I'll share my experience. When I first started learning metta practice, it was anything for me. It was anything but pleasurable. It was mechanical and unsatisfactory, and very much glad to be finished with it when the particular guided meditation, or my rare attempt at doing it without guidance. And then somewhere along the way, I adopted a different attitude towards it, understanding that it was, potentially pleasurable. People talk about it that way. Began to find some language that worked a little bit, and then was utterly astonished the first time that this simple, still sort of rote almost process just brought forth these potent feelings of love and affection and compassion that, it was overwhelming. And then what's been striking is that since finding that way of eliciting this, it didn't go away. It's not like, well, okay, that worked once or it worked 3 or 4 times. It's just still true. It's very striking to me. I've spoken to you, Mark, about unease about sort of pursuing this simply because it feels good. It does feel good. Oh my goodness. It feels really good. Anyway, that's what I had to share.
Yeah. And I think, one of the takeaways from our discussion tonight is just to look at our relationship with pleasure, because we have some baggage around pleasure, like, do I deserve, like, I'm talking now more the wholesome end of pleasure, like metta and dana, generosity, and the quieting of our mind, and the other wholesome qualities that arise in a spiritual life that are really healing and satisfying. And we can somehow not feel like we're deserving of it, or because it is still temporary or won't always be that way, like, oh, I'm not going to let it have its healing effect. But the Buddha was very clear, like, we really want to let even ordinary sensual pleasures, we want to let it land and have its effect. So if somebody makes you a nice bowl of soup, you know, you don't want to be dismissive. Well, I'll eat it and it will be done in 15 minutes. And but that whole thing of the generosity to the person who made the soup, the taste of the soup, the effect on the body you feel from the warmth and the nutrition, and then your own gratitude. It's like you have this feast of pleasantness, and even knowing that it's pleasant is pleasant. You know, it's just kind of builds on itself. And all of that, it's like, why would we want to miss that? We have to become better at seeing the beauty, seeing the goodness, and experiencing wholesome pleasure. And retraining the heart, you know, if we do have any of that baggage of feeling for whatever reasons that we don't deserve it because we've been bad or something, because we all have been bad. You know, I don't know of anybody who, but you don't have to be good to experience healing pleasure. So we'll continue our conversation in the weeks ahead. Wishing all those of you who practice Merry Christmas and happy holidays. And next week, I'll just mention we'll have our normal program, but it's also the beginning of our New Year's Eve celebration. But you can come just for the normal Tuesday night program. And then right after this ends, we'll probably end like at 8:15 or 8:25, so a little bit earlier next week. And then Shelley Graff, the other guiding teacher at Common Ground, and Stacy McClendon, one of our teachers, and Wynn Fricke, another one of our teachers, will lead everyone in a kind of a conversation about beginning the New Year's and New Year reflections, I guess. And then there'll be a break, and then there's music. Gabe Keller Flores is going to perform, and Ellis Delaney, two wonderful singer-songwriters. And then even for those who want to stay later, there will be some chanting and silent sitting before midnight. So you can find out more from the calendar listing for the New Year's Eve celebration. So maybe we'll see each other next Tuesday. Take care, everybody. Feel free to say good night if you want.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care, everybody.